Ozymandias is a poem by the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, published in 1818 in The Examiner. This 14-verse Petrarchan sonnet has an octave, or the first 8 verses, focusing on the statue, while the final 6 verses or sestet, focus on the pedestal and surroundings. The poem is written in the iambic pentameter with a rhyme scheme of ABABACDCDFEF. The poem's primary speaker is an anonymous person who meets an unknown traveler who is the poem's secondary speaker. The title of the poem is a reference to the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. Don't forget to share and subscribe. Shelley might have gotten the idea for Ozymandias after reading newspaper reports about the British Museum's acquisition of a massive fragment from an ancient Egyptian statue. The sculpture was later identified as depicting Ramesses II, or Ozymandias, as the Greeks called him. The poem is often read, at least in part, as a reflection on the political climate of Shelley's day, especially the rise and fall of Napoleon. In this light, Ozymandias becomes a cautionary tale for those who chase after power and glory. No matter how mighty a ruler may seem, time will eventually reduce their empires to dust, just as it did for the once great king the poem describes. Shelley was likely responding to the 1816 announcement that a colossal statue fragment of Ramesses II, dating back to the 13th century BC, was being transported to the British Museum. The Italian explorer Giovanni Battista Belzoni had recovered the 7.25-ton piece, which included the statue's head and upper torso, from Ramesses's mortuary temple at Thebes. Scholars believe that what inspired Shelley wasn't the visual grandeur of the statue itself, but rather its dramatic description in reports and historical texts. Interestingly, Shelley wasn't alone in turning this moment into poetry. He wrote his sonnet in friendly competition with his friend Horace Smith, who also penned a version of the story. Both poems were published in The Examiner, just weeks apart. Shelley's sonnet may also have drawn on a passage by the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, who recorded the supposed inscription on the statue. King of kings Ozymandias am I. If any want to know how great I am and where I lie, let him outdo me in my work. Shelley's Ozymandias paints a vivid picture of a ruined statue in a faraway desert. The statue, once built to honor a powerful ancient king, has been reduced to just 2 giant stone legs still standing and a broken face lying in the sand. On the pedestal is an inscription in which the king boldly calls himself the King of Kings, claiming that his works are so impressive they will make even the most powerful observers tremble. But what we see around the statue is desolation, broken stone, and silence, which tells a very different story. This contrast between the king's boastful words and the ruined state of his statue is where the poem's real message lies. Shelley uses this image to explore the idea that all political power, no matter how strong or seemingly permanent, will eventually crumble with time. The speaker of the poem doesn't witness the statue himself. He hears about it from a traveler, adding a sense of distance and myth, as if the memory of the king and his empire has already begun to fade into legend. What survives of the statue is a pair of legs, a shattered face, and a base with an inscription that is a mere shadow of the grandeur it was meant to represent. The poem calls attention to how time has not only destroyed the statue but has completely erased the kingdom it once towered over. After the king declares, "Look on my works, ye mighty," and despair, the speaker immediately tells us, "Nothing beside remains." This sudden shift is striking as it exposes the king's arrogant belief in his own lasting greatness as laughably misplaced. He had hoped that his empire would persist, that his monuments would keep his legacy alive long after his death. Instead, all that's left is a ruin in the middle of a lifeless desert. The lone and level sands stretch out in every direction, swallowing any trace of the civilization that once existed there. What makes Shelley's critique especially sharp is the way he presents the king's cruelty. The statue's face, though broken, still carries a frown and a sneer of cold command, expressions of arrogance and tyranny. These emotions, once wielded as tools of power, now survive only in stone, carved into what the poem calls lifeless things. This detail turns the statue into a kind of moral lesson. Tyrants may try to preserve their power through monuments and memory, but history has a way of reducing even the most fearsome rulers to rubble. Shelley's poem is a commentary on the futility of authoritarian rule and the illusion of permanence. Importantly, Ozymandias isn't entirely fictional. The name is a Greek version of Ramses II, a real Egyptian pharaoh known for his military conquests and for commissioning massive statues of himself. Shelley draws on this historical figure to remind readers that even real empires that once seemed indestructible have been undone by time. Ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded an inscription reportedly found on one of Ramses' statues, "King of kings am I, Ozymandias. If anyone would know how great I am and where I lie, let him surpass one of my works." Shelley echoes this inscription, not to glorify it, but to expose the deep irony in such declarations. The poem is a reminder that no matter how powerful a ruler may seem, time is always more powerful. Even the so-called King of Kings ends up forgotten, buried in sand, in a land that has moved on without him. In Ozymandias, Shelley talks about arrogance brought low by time. The poem's title character, Ozymandias, stands as a classic example of hubris or excessive pride, especially common among those in power. He once built a massive monument in the middle of a desolate desert, clearly intended to show off his greatness and intimidate others. Yet now, that monument lies in ruins. All that remains is a broken statue, half buried in sand, and an inscription bragging about his might. "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." While it was meant to command awe and fear, it now seems almost laughable, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. Shelley uses this contrast between the grand words and the crumbling statue to highlight the futility of human pride. The once feared ruler's legacy has been reduced to fragments. Even the sculpted sneer of cold command on the statue's face that was meant to show strength but now just reinforces his arrogance and detachment. Shelley deepens this irony through dramatic imagery. The physical decay of the monument reflects the collapse of Ozymandias' power. The statue's shattered state becomes a symbol of how all empires and rulers, no matter how powerful, are ultimately at the mercy of time. The poem doesn't just critique Ozymandias himself but also delivers a broader warning: no human achievement is permanent. Power fades, monuments crumble, and time eventually levels all things. The image of Ozymandias' broken statue in the empty desert isn't just a comment on one king's pride, it's a metaphor for the inevitable decline of all human endeavors. The poem's closing verses, where the lone and level sands stretch far away, leave us with a powerful visual of how little remains when pride has run its course. The king, Ozymandias, thought he was invincible. The inscription on the pedestal boldly tells the mighty to look on my works and despair, as though his power and empire would last forever. But ironically, there are no works left to look at. The grand cities, the empire, and the legacy are all gone. Time has wiped it all away. And yet, something has survived: art. Even though the statue is ruined and is just fragments buried in sand, but it still speaks. The sculptor's skill comes through in the little details: the wrinkled lip, the sneer of cold command. These features capture Ozymandias' personality, his pride, his arrogance, maybe even his cruelty. Though Ozymandias is long dead, the artist who sculpted him has preserved a glimpse of what kind of ruler he was. Art can preserve human character and emotion, even when everything else fades. The statue is made of lifeless stone, yet Ozymandias' passions still survive in its carved features. The sculptor didn't just create a likeness, but he read the king's personality and translated it into art. That's what Shelley means when he says the artist mocked those passions, not mocked as in ridiculed, but copied them with insight and skill. So even in its wrecked state, the statue tells a story. It holds on to a piece of human history. Shelley also highlights the power of writing. The inscription on the pedestal is what makes this story come alive. Without it, we might not even know who this king was. The statue alone shows arrogance, but the words preserve his name, his title, and his ultimate failure. Ozymandias' own proclamation is what makes the fall of his empire feel so ironic and so powerful. It's a written work, etched in stone, that gives us the full picture of his downfall. So, while Ozymandias' kingdom may be gone, the art in the form of both the statue and the poem lives on. Shelley's work reminds us that human creations can outlast their creators, not through monuments of power, but through expressions of thought, feeling, and creativity. In that way, art becomes a kind of immortality by preserving stories, people, and emotions across time. The despair Ozymandias commands turn into wonder as readers reflect on how, despite everything, his story still survives through the very medium he may have underestimated: art.